All right, we are here for chapter 15, the period of Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877. And we see this image of some newly freed slaves after the Civil War outside of a schoolhouse. And for blacks, they now have freedom for the first time. All African Americans are freed in this nation, and they're seeking to escape the horrors and injustices of slavery and finally gain some opportunities that whites have enjoyed for hundreds of years, including citizenship and the right to vote. So these newly freed slaves will hold meetings, have religious services without white supervision. They'll move about freely, looking for work, looking for separated family members, buying guns, and owning things that they were denied them their whole lives. So the church was the center of these newly freed slaves' lives, and most blacks left the white churches and established their own. And the most popular, most common were the Methodist and the Baptist churches, and they grew rapidly. And like I said, that became the center of black life. Freedmen sought to improve themselves through education, and they learned to read and to write. Um, Learning the Bible was essential. Getting involved in politics. Colleges were established for them, and so school was central to that. So the meaning of freedom, a lot of it was based on the opportunities for land ownership, and that was a key to a sense of freedom. Many slaves believed that they earned the rights to this land through hundreds of years of unpaid labor as slaves. Unfortunately, that land was not given to them by the American government. So the idea of freedom based on self-ownership, having a stable family, religious liberty, political participation, and economic independence as well. We see a former slave plantation on the left, and then afterwards how the plantation is now divided up through the system of sharecropping, where slaves will tend different parts of the land. Northerners are going to have their own vision of freedom, which involves free labor. So blacks in this vision will become wage workers and landowners, just like the free whites in the North. The northern investors will inject their capital and move into the South to rebuild their economy. And the South would eventually resemble the free society of the North. That was the vision, anyway, for the North. Freedmen's Bureau, tremendous accomplishment. It was their job. They were tasked with establishing schools, providing aid to the poor, health care, fighting equal treatment for the former slaves and also for the white unionists. So that was a very, very important part of Reconstruction. We're going to see the failure of land reform, however. When President Lincoln was assassinated, President Johnson was thrust into the presidency, and he did not have African Americans in mind in his vision. So all of the land that was given to them, thinking back to General Sherman's Field Order Number 15, that confiscated land was returned back to the former white owners, confining black men to farm work, unskilled labor, service jobs, essentially rendering them second-class citizens for another 100 years. We see a mother and a daughter reading here, so despite the limited opportunities for blacks in the South, they are still trying to improve themselves. Sharecropping, families are going to rent part of a plantation, and the crop is divided between the worker and the owner at the end of the year. It was ideal over gang labor where you're supervised by a white person, but it was still an oppressive system with limited opportunities to be for profit, and many of the sharecropping farmers, including whites as well, will fall deeply into debt throughout the second half of the 1800s. As the entire world experienced an influx of farming, Argentina, Australia, the United States, we're going to see prices go down across the globe, hurting farmers' profits. So for white farmers to get supplies from merchants, oftentimes they were forced to grow cotton and commit part of their crop as collateral. So this was known as the crop lien system. So these are two new ways of farming after the Civil War, which will not be beneficial to the majority, unfortunately. A couple of years after the Civil War is over, we see these um, African Americans in the cotton fields after the Civil War, sharecropping family. And we see this map, the percentage of farms that were sharecropped by county. And as you can see in the Deep South, the percentages were quite high. So Andrew Johnson, mentioned before, Lincoln's vice president, deeply racist, did not believe blacks had a role to play in Reconstruction. And the failure of presidential Reconstruction, Southern whites who were voted back in, they're prominent Confederates and the old elites to power. So those in power before the Civil War, not too long after, will be in power after it. New way of keeping African Americans down after slavery was abolished were the black codes. So African Americans were denied the right to testify against whites, to serve on juries, to vote. They were allowed to be arrested if they refused to sign labor contracts. Children could be assigned to work for their former masters without parental consent. But we're going to have the radical Republicans, men such as Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, who are going to work diligently to try to get rights for the African Americans. So you had your moderate Republicans and your radicals. The radicals were looking for deep-seated changes. There's Thaddeus Stevens here. I'm not sure what he's reaching for in his pocket. Great Pennsylvania representative. So the Civil Rights Bill was written, and it granted citizenship regardless of race and equality before the law. We'll know that later as the 14th Amendment. And it also offered protections against the black codes. However, the bill said nothing of black suffrage. Johnson's going to veto both of these bills, claimed that he was defending states' rights and he was concerned about whites being discriminated and too much federal power. And he said blacks did not deserve citizenship. However, in April of 1866, so a year after the end of the Civil War, the Civil Rights Bill will become the first major law in American history to be passed anyway over a presidential veto. So they got their two-thirds vote. 14th Amendment, we stated that previously, tremendous achievement. We're going to see many Supreme Court cases in the 1900s that will reinforce this equal protection of the law clause, which unfortunately in this time period will be no guarantee. The compromise for the 14th Amendment didn't provide for black suffrage, but there was a stipulation if a state denied voting rights, then they could have a reduction in their representation in Congress. Here's a post-Civil War photograph of an unidentified black family. So you can see the conditions that they're living in. This is abject poverty here. During Reconstruction, all of the southern states, except for Tennessee, refused to ratify the amendment, the 14th Amendment. And this is going to push the moderate Republicans toward the radical camp. So together, the radicals and the moderates will pass the Reconstruction Act, which is going to divide the South into 5 military districts, call for new state governments that allow black men to vote. And in order to check the power of President Johnson, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which forbade Johnson to fire anybody in the cabinet that without the Senate's consent. And Johnson tested that act by firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who was loyal to the radicals, and so Johnson was impeached by Congress for high crimes and misdemeanors. A deal was struck. Johnson was found not guilty by a single vote. Johnson promised to not meddle anymore in the affairs of Congress, and in return, he was able to keep his job and not leave completely in shame. But he was not renominated by the Republicans, obviously. And election of 1868, Ulysses Grant, Civil War hero, will defeat Horatio Seymour. And Grant's going to be a two-termer. He'll be elected in 68 and 1872. We can see a Democratic Party broadside from the election of 1866 in Pennsylvania. And this is our motto. This is a white man's country. Let white men rule. So that will be a common theme throughout the 1800s, where the South will heavily defend white rights and put down African Americans. Here's the distribution of electoral votes from the election of 1866. 68, Grant is going to defeat Seymour quite easily. 15th Amendment, 1870, 5 years after the Civil War, will grant black suffrage. It was ratified in 1870, and it's going to enable states to make restrictions not based on race. Literacy tests, property requirements, poll taxes, so there were still ways of stopping black men from voting through these methods. And this will last well into the 1960s. So even though African American men were given the right to vote, they were not really able to, especially after the period of Reconstruction. They were able to for a short time while the army was there to protect them, but that's going to come to an end in 1877. So we have the Great Constitutional Revolution. So the guarantees of legal equality are going to affect the discriminatory laws that were throughout the North. So blacks that were being discriminated in the North as well are now protected by the 15th Amendment. So here's an image from Harper's Weekly showing the first vote for African Americans. Very historic. So the feminists, who are also moving for their own rights, equality, the right to vote, they're going to split over the 14th and the 15th Amendments. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, they opposed the 15th Amendment because it did not give women the right to vote. They tried to sever women's rights from abolitionism, and some even appealed to racism to demand rights for women, saying that only white women should be given the right to vote. A couple positives from this period of Reconstruction: 2,000 African Americans held public office at this time. 2 blacks were elected to the U.S. Senate, 14 to the House of Reps. There was even a black governor in Louisiana. And many blacks served in the state legislatures, held important offices like sheriff, tax assessor, policeman, and most of these were former slaves. So truly amazing achievements in such a short amount of time. Here are black and white members of the Mississippi Senate together. You can see the large number of African American men elected. Northerners who migrate down to the South after the war, these are known as carpetbaggers. A lot of them were former soldiers. Some were people that wanted to help the newly freed slaves, help them out. These are a group of people that not well liked in the South. Same with the scalawags. And these are your Southern white Republicans who are often seen as traitors. All right, so there were Southern Republicans in power during Reconstruction. Their best accomplishment were the state-supported public schools. Tremendous accomplishment. We are going to see opponents of Reconstruction. You'll have poor whites who will bolt to the Democratic Party after their economic situations remain bleak. Many of these people didn't accept the fact that blacks should vote, hold office, have equality, and they wanted the return of white supremacy. All right, and we're also going to have a reign of terror in this time period. So the KKK was created by former Confederate soldiers who were trying to keep African Americans below white people, and the KKK will try to prevent blacks from voting. They're going to murder key Republican leaders and officials and really establish a reign of terror throughout the South. And they'll come in 3 waves: after the Civil War, after World War I, and again after World War II and the Civil Rights Movement. President Grant will send troops to suppress the KKK, and he's going to find most areas peaceful by 1872, but then there'll be a resurgence again after this. Here is a image of the KKK. You can see the donkey, which is the Democratic Party, and the KKK was the right hand of the Democratic Party. They were their muscle. And you can see here a carpetbagger, someone from Ohio. Maybe this is a scalawag. So they employed methods of terror, lynchings and shootings and all kinds of murderous activity. Here's some images